In 1997, while on a cruise, I had a lot of free time because we were at sea for a few days. I do not usually watch much television, but because I was not so busy, I followed the news that was being relayed via satellite. At that time, there was a horrendous story that struck me and lingers in my memory to this day. In Rancho Santa Fe in California, 39 persons were found dead on their beds in a rented mansion. They wore similar clothing, dark tracksuits and Nike sneakers, and a plastic bag over their heads. They were partly shrouded by a purple scarf. They had drunk apple juice and vodka with a mixture of phenobarbital and hydrocodone. The world was shocked at this mass suicide. These people were members of a cult known as Heaven's Gate. The couple, Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, launched this cult in 1974. When they met, Nettles was a psychiatric nurse and Applewhite was a patient. As a couple, they changed their name to Bo and Peep. 11 years later, Nettles died of cancer. Before she died, their belief was a hodgepodge of Presbyterian Christianity mixed with elements of science fiction from Star Wars and Close Encounters. They believed that their body was just a shell encasing their essential spiritual feature. The members of the sect had to leave their families and hand over their assets to the organization. After Nettles died, Applewhite became obsessed with emerging from this material shell and being more spiritual. He insisted on refraining from alcohol, from eating fast foods, and they wanted to suppress their sexual urges. Some of the members even castrated themselves. He convinced his followers that he was the second coming of Christ, that God was an advanced alien, and they were nearing the end of times. This was one of the first cults to use the internet as a means of communication. Many of its members financed the cult by creating commercial websites for various clients. In the early 90s, these members became more detached from social life and started recruiting new members via the internet. In the meantime, in the real world, in July 1995, two astronomers, one professional and one amateur, Alan Hale and Thomas Bopp, discovered a comet that they named Hale-Bopp. This discovery gave a purpose to the cult. Their idea was not to kill themselves. They just wanted to separate the spirit from the material shell and to fly into a space vehicle that they believed was hidden behind the Hale-Bopp comet. At that time, the comet was passing very close to Earth. The mass suicide happened over 3 days, and their leader, Marshall Applewhite, was one of the last ones to die. But he wasn't the last. They believed that they were liberating themselves so that they could fly to the spaceship. That ship would then follow Hale-Bopp to lead them to a new life in space. Instead, as we all know, on the 26th of March 1997, 39 members of Heaven's Gate, including Marshall Applewhite, wearing dark tracksuits and Nike sneakers, were found dead, covered in purple sheets, in that large mansion in California. This was not the only case of mass suicide by a sect following a fantasy-prone cult leader. There have been others. It is a great pity. This happened because a delusional guru influenced a number of followers who were vulnerable and perhaps were passing through some difficult times. That is why it is important to adopt critical thinking, that when there is an unusual claim, we weigh, examine, and question for evidence. Sometimes we find people who do not distinguish between fantasy and reality. As I have always said, fantasy and imagination are delightful and important because they can help us to be creative and sometimes to forget the drab reality around us. However, we have to keep our feet firmly on the ground. Before accepting extraordinary claims, we have to look for evidence. Today's story was rather morbid, but an unfortunate fact. It is important that we face reality and learn from past mistakes. If you are interested in these vlogs, follow and like. If you have any questions or comments, send an email on shettico@gmail.com. Until we meet again for our next vlog, goodbye.